In the summer of 2016, a 27-year-old graphic designer named Maya Hartley disappeared without a trace in the Tonto National Forest, outside Payson, Arizona, less than a couple of hours from Phoenix. For 3 years, her family kept searching. Investigators chased every lead they could justify, and volunteers combed mile after mile of rugged country, hoping for something, anything, that would explain how a capable hiker could simply vanish. But Maya vanished so completely that as seasons turned and headlines faded, even optimists began to whisper the same grim conclusion. She wasn't coming back. Then, in June 2019, during a routine patrol in a remote pocket of forest that most hikers never reached, 2 rangers found something they would carry for the rest of their lives. A woman was sitting upright at the base of a ponderosa pine, as if the tree itself were holding her in place. Her shirt, once green, hung in torn, filthy strips. She was impossibly thin, her skin grayish under the dust, her eyes half open, her breathing shallow enough to miss if you looked away. It was Maya Hartley, and the question that followed would become one of the most baffling and disturbing mysteries in recent Arizona missing person history. The day she disappeared, on June 15, 2016, Maya left her apartment in Tempe at around 7:30 a.m. Building security cameras later showed her with a small day pack, hiking boots, and practical trail clothes. Nothing unusual, nothing that looked like a goodbye. She told her roommate, Samantha Reed, she planned a day hike in the Tonto and would be back by early evening. Samantha would later tell police Maya seemed lighter that morning. Not reckless, just relieved. Work had been grinding her down for weeks, and she wanted what she always wanted when the city felt too loud. Quiet, trees, and a long walk where nobody expected anything from her. Maya wasn't new to hiking. Friends described her as outdoorsy and meticulous. She'd grown up camping with her dad in northern Arizona. She knew how to read maps. She wasn't the type to wander into the backcountry with a phone battery at 3% and no water. That morning, according to the log at the ranger station near Payson, Maya signed in at the Highline Trail trailhead at 9:16 a.m. The ranger on duty, Caleb Morgan, remembered her because she asked about water along the route. He told her seasonal streams might be running, but cautioned her not to rely on them and to carry enough water regardless. Maya thanked him, adjusted her pack straps, and headed onto the trail. That was the last confirmed sighting. The Highline Trail is a well-known route that cuts through pine stands and rocky ridge lines, opening into meadows when the terrain allows. In early summer, it draws day hikers and backpackers chasing mild temperatures and green scenery before the real heat arrives. That day, the weather was clear around 75 degrees, no storms forecast, visibility wide open. Conditions weren't just good, they were ideal, which made it worse. By 10 p.m., Maya still hadn't come home. She hadn't answered calls or texts. Samantha tried again and again. Every call rolled straight to voicemail. At first, Samantha told herself the most common lie people tell when they're scared. She lost track of time. She's fine. She'll walk in any minute. By 11:30 p.m., she called Maya's parents in Flagstaff. Maya's father, Michael Hartley, didn't argue. He didn't wait until morning. He drove straight down toward the valley, arriving in Tempe a little after 2 a.m., to find Samantha already on the phone with police. The officer who took the report suggested waiting a few more hours. Hikers sometimes camp overnight. Sometimes phones die. Sometimes people don't realize how late it's gotten. Michael's response was immediate and simple. Maya would never do that without calling. He knew her habits, he knew her caution, and he knew fear when it arrived in the body. Quiet, heavy, and certain. The search. By morning, search and rescue teams were dispatched to the Highline Trail. They started at the trailhead where Maya had signed in and worked methodically along the main route, checking side trails, overlooks, steep drop-offs, ravines. Anywhere an injury could hide someone. Dogs were brought in for scent. Helicopters swept the canopy with thermal imaging. Volunteers arrived in waves, spreading across the forest, calling her name, marking areas they'd cleared. For the first 3 days, the operation was aggressive. Grid patterns, creek beds, boulder fields, thorny brush, dense manzanita. People crawled through places no casual hiker would even look at. They found nothing. No footprints that made sense, no scraps of clothing, no gear, no sign of a struggle, no sign of a fall. It wasn't like the forest had swallowed her. It was like she had stepped between frames of reality and disappeared. One volunteer, Dylan Price, later described those days as unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. He said they searched ravines so steep they had to lower themselves by hand, and thickets so thick they had to push through on elbows and knees. Still nothing. On the 6th day, officials scaled back the search. The incident commander told the family they'd covered a far larger area than Maya could reasonably have reached in one day, even if she'd wandered off trail early. The scent dogs lost her within the first mile. Helicopter crews saw no heat signatures consistent with a missing person. The unspoken conclusion hovered in every conversation. Either Maya had left the area somehow, or something catastrophic had happened in a place so unforgiving it erased her. Michael refused to accept it. For weeks after the official effort ended, he returned again and again, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. He walked the same routes, studied maps, questioned other hikers, and taped flyers at trailheads, gas stations, rest stops between Payson and Phoenix. Maya's photo, bright-eyed and alive, stared out from paper that slowly faded in the sun. No one called with answers. Her bank accounts showed no activity. Her phone never reconnected to a network. Her car, still parked near the ranger station, was eventually towed and returned to her family. By late 2016, the story had mostly slipped from the news cycle. There were anniversary mentions, brief updates, the same questions asked in slightly different words. How does someone disappear in a place that was searched this hard? In 2017, Michael organized a second large volunteer push with help from a non-profit specializing in missing hikers. New search zones, rechecked reports, interviews with people who'd been on the trail around that time. Nothing. In 2018, the family hired a private investigator. Months of review produced a report that offered possibilities, but no proof. Foul play, or an accident in a location so remote it could take years, decades to find remains. The family was crushed. And still, they didn't stop hoping. June 2019. The discovery. On June 10, 2019, two park rangers Ethan Cole and Marissa Shaw were conducting a routine patrol in a section of the Tonto, about 8 miles southeast of the Highline Trail. It wasn't a popular area. The terrain was punishing, the underbrush thick, the slopes steep enough to make every step feel like work. They were checking for illegal campsites and wildfire risk when Marissa noticed something that didn't belong. At first, it looked like old fabric snagged in brush. But as they moved closer, the fabric resolved into a human outline, upright, motionless, leaning against a large ponderosa pine. The woman's legs were stretched out. Her arms lay limp at her sides. Her shirt was torn to rags. Her pants were shredded at the knees. Her face was gaunt, cheeks hollow, skin dull beneath grime. Marissa called out. No response. Ethan dropped to a knee and checked for a pulse. Faint. Irregular. But there. He radioed for medical extraction, reading off their coordinates and describing her condition. Marissa stayed close, speaking softly, trying to anchor the woman to the moment. The woman didn't blink, didn't track their faces, didn't react, until Marissa touched her shoulder gently. Then, barely, her eyes shifted, as if registering life from very far away. Rescue arrived within 40 minutes by helicopter. Ground access was too rough. Paramedics assessed her on site. Dangerously low body temperature, profound dehydration, severe malnutrition, and muscle wasting so advanced it looked like the result of years, not weeks. Her hands were scarred and calloused. Her feet were bare, filthy, cut and bruised. They wrapped her in thermal blankets, started an IV, stabilized her as best they could, and loaded her onto a stretcher for airlift to a hospital in Phoenix Sonoran Valley Medical Center. During the flight, she remained silent, eyes open, unfocused, breathing shallow but steady. Only after she was admitted did anyone think to confirm who she was. A nurse noticed a small scar on her forearm, an identifying detail referenced in the original missing person report. Staff pulled the old file, compared the photo to the woman in the hospital bed, and the match snapped into place with a sickening certainty. It was Maya Hartley. And within hours, the phone call that Michael Hartley had waited 3 years for finally arrived. News traveled through the hospital the way certain stories always do, fast, disbelieving, almost reverent. A missing hiker, gone for 3 years, had been brought in alive. Staff tried to keep details contained, but a case like this never stays contained for long. That afternoon in Flagstaff, Michael Hartley answered a call from an unfamiliar Phoenix number. The voice on the line belonged to Detective Grant Larson with the Phoenix Police Department. He spoke carefully, like someone delivering fragile glass. A woman matching Maya's description had been found in the Tonto National Forest. She was alive. She was in critical condition. She was being treated at Sonoran Valley Medical Center in Phoenix. Michael didn't ask questions. He didn't argue. He just moved, keys in hand, out the door, the rest of the world narrowing to a single point. My daughter is alive. By the time he arrived at the hospital, Detective Larson and an administrator met him outside the ICU doors. They tried to prepare him, warned him that Maya had suffered extreme physical trauma from prolonged exposure, dehydration, and starvation. They told him she wasn't responsive, and that no one yet knew how much of her mind had survived what her body clearly had. Michael nodded, but the words didn't land. He only understood the final line. "She's here." When he stepped into the intensive care unit and saw the woman in the bed, he stopped, as if the floor had shifted under him. Maya had always been strong in the way active people are, healthy, bright-eyed, quick to smile. The person in front of him now looked like a fragile imitation. Her face was hollow, skin stretched tight over bone. Her arms were so thin they seemed too light to belong to a living body. Her hair, once thick and dark, was matted and streaked with dirt, cut unevenly as if by her own hands. Her eyes were open, but they didn't focus. Michael approached slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter her. He said her name softly, then louder. Nothing. He took her hand. It felt light and cold. For a moment, he thought her fingers twitched against his palm. Something small, like a signal from deep underwater. But the doctors couldn't tell him if it was intentional or a reflex. All they could tell him was that she was fighting, even if she didn't look like it. What the doctors found. Over the following days, specialists worked in layers, stabilized the body first, then try to understand what remained underneath. Blood work showed severe nutritional deficiencies, especially vitamin B12 and vitamin D, the kind seen in prolonged malnutrition and minimal sun exposure. Her muscles had atrophied dramatically, suggesting extended periods of limited movement. Imaging revealed stress fractures that had healed poorly, and older rib injuries that had mended without medical care. A trauma specialist, Dr. Elise Carver, noted patterns that felt less like a single catastrophic event and more like long-term survival. scars across Maya's hands consistent with repeated scraping or digging, and thick calluses on her feet that spoke of months, possibly years, walking barefoot on hard ground. Her teeth were in rough shape, too, several cracked or worn down, as if she'd been forced to chew tough roots, bark, or other hard material just to keep calories moving into her system. But the most alarming damage wasn't in the scans, it was in the silence. Maya didn't speak. She didn't react to voices in any meaningful way. Sometimes her eyes tracked motion in the room, but there was no recognition, no emotion, no sign she understood where she was or who stood over her. A neurologist described it as a kind of dissociative shutdown. The brain's last resort defense when trauma or isolation stretches beyond what the mind can safely hold. Instead of processing reality, the mind retreats, conserving itself in the only way it can. Detective Larson listened to the medical briefings with a tight, impatient focus. The physical evidence told one story, the time gap told another, and the location where Maya had been found raised questions that refused to stay quiet. Back to the forest. The spot where the rangers discovered Maya was roughly 8 miles from the Highline Trail and deep in terrain that hadn't been included in the original search grid. It was thick with underbrush and steep enough in places that even experienced hikers avoided it. Larson organized a return to the site with a mixed team, rangers, forensics, and search specialists, hoping to find evidence of a shelter, belongings, anything that could explain how Maya survived and why she hadn't been found earlier. What they found felt arranged. The ground around the tree where Maya had been sitting was unusually clear, as if debris had been removed repeatedly to keep a small space open. There was no tent, no obvious modern shelter. But a few feet away, stones had been placed in a rough circle, an old fire ring, and inside it were layers of char and ash that suggested not one fire, but many, made over a long stretch of time. Forensics sifted the ash and confirmed it held only natural materials: wood, plant matter, no trace of matches, lighters, fuel canisters, or modern tools. Nearby, they noticed a shallow depression in the earth that looked intentionally used, like a simple basin for catching rainwater. The soil around it was compacted and smooth, the kind of texture that comes from repeated hands and repeated days. A short distance away was a small pile of animal bones: rabbit, squirrel, birds picked clean, some cracked open in ways consistent with someone trying to get every last bit of marrow. And then there was the fabric. Torn scraps, weathered by sun and time. The remnants matched what Maya had worn the day she disappeared. The green cotton shirt she'd left Tempe in, now shredded and filthy, was the same one she still had on when the rangers found her. But her other gear was gone. No boots, no backpack, no phone, no map, no knife, no water bottle. If she'd started out prepared, the forest had stripped her down to almost nothing except that shirt, hanging on her like a stubborn thread connecting past to present. One detail made the team fall silent. On the trunk of the ponderosa pine, deep scratches had been carved into the bark in grouped sets. 5 marks, then another 5, then another like. Tally marks made to count time. They weren't random. They weren't animal damage. They were deliberate. The team counted over 400. If those marks represented weeks, Maya had been tracking the passage of time for years, until, at some point, she stopped. The last set was incomplete, the final line unfinished, as if she'd simply let the counting go. Larson stood there staring at the scars in the bark, imagining what it meant to carve time into a living tree. What kind of mind keeps counting? And what kind of mind finally gives up? Possible doesn't mean probable. Larson brought in a survival instructor, Marcus Hale, former military, years of wilderness endurance training, to assess the location and the evidence. Hale was blunt. Yes, it was theoretically possible for a person to survive long-term in the forest, but it required extraordinary skill, mental durability, and luck, especially if the person had no formal survival training. And the location itself wasn't ideal. There was no reliable water source nearby. The canopy was dense, limiting sunlight and warmth. The terrain made travel slow and dangerous. If a lost hiker wanted to be found, most would move toward trails, roads, streams, anything with a chance of human contact. The fact that Maya seemed to have remained in a remote pocket like this suggested something else had kept her there. A physical injury, psychological collapse, fear, or another person. Hale didn't say that last part out loud, but Larson heard it anyway. The slow return back at Sonoran Valley Medical Center, Maya's body began to respond to treatment. Her vitals stabilized. Fluids and carefully monitored nutrition started to reverse the most immediate dangers. But her mind remained distant. She lay in bed, staring upward, expression blank, hands resting at her sides, as if her body no longer belonged to her. Nurses tried simple questions. Yes or no. Blink if you understand. Squeeze my hand, without consistent results. Michael visited every day. He talked to her about childhood memories, family trips, stupid jokes she used to groan at, the dog she'd begged for in middle school, the way she used to sing off-key in the car. Sometimes he thought he saw something flicker behind her eyes, but it was always gone before he could trust it. Dr. Carver consulted a psychiatrist specializing in trauma and catatonic states, Dr. Nora Whitaker. Whitaker didn't push Maya. She observed. She spoke softly. She treated the silence like a symptom, not a choice. In her notes, Whitaker described Maya's condition as similar to what's sometimes seen after prolonged captivity or extreme isolation, when the brain, overwhelmed and exhausted, shuts down the bridges to the outside world as a way to survive itself. Recovery, she warned, could take months or years. And even with the best care, there were no guarantees about who Maya would be when she came back. When the story leaked, as soon as the first staff member whispered the name outside the wrong room, the story escaped. Arizona outlets picked it up first. Then bigger platforms amplified the headline until it became a national fixation. Missing hiker found alive after 3 years. Reporters camped outside the hospital. Social media erupted with theories. Some called it a miracle. Others called it impossible. People argued over what they wanted the story to be. A woman who survived against nature itself. A woman who suffered a breakdown and disappeared into a fugue state. A woman who chose to vanish. A woman who was held. But the evidence Larson had seen didn't fit neatly into any comforting narrative. Not the missing gear. Not the tally marks. Not the repeated fire use. Not the way Maya's body carried the signature of time. And there was one truth Larson couldn't escape. The only person who could explain the missing years was Maya. And Maya still wasn't speaking. Weeks passed in the slow, ritual way hospitals measured time. Vitals, labs, soft voices, the hush of night shifts. Maya's physical recovery moved forward in careful increments. A little more nutrition, a little more strength, a few assisted steps. But her mind stayed partially behind a locked door. Dr. Nora Whitaker kept her sessions deliberately gentle. She didn't interrogate Maya's memory. She didn't demand a timeline. Instead, she narrated the present in a calm, steady tone. Where Maya was, what day it was, what the weather looked like beyond the window, what sounds belonged to the hospital, and what sounds didn't. It was orientation without pressure, a way of telling Maya's nervous system, you're safe and you're not alone. Michael continued his daily visits, bringing small pieces of Maya's old life, a childhood photo, a bracelet she used to wear, a worn sketchbook from college. He placed them within her view like breadcrumbs leading back to herself. Sometimes Maya's eyes drifted toward the objects. Sometimes they didn't. Then, in late August 2019, something changed. The first deliberate moment a nurse named Patricia Nguyen was adjusting Maya's IV and checking her monitors when she noticed Maya's fingers curl. Subtle, weak, but controlled. Patricia paused, watching. Maya's hand moved again, this time reaching toward the blanket edge. Her fingers caught the fabric, held it for a second, then released. Patricia spoke softly, asking if Maya could hear her. No words came, but Maya's eyes shifted, focused on Patricia's face for the first time since admission. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was unmistakably real. Attention, presence, a small return. Patricia called Dr. Whitaker immediately. Whitaker entered slowly, speaking the same way she always did, careful not to flood Maya with stimuli. She asked simple questions. "Where are you? Can you hear me? Are you in pain?" Maya didn't answer, but when Whitaker gently touched Maya's hand, Maya's fingers closed around hers for a brief moment before letting go. It was progress in the only form progress sometimes comes. Small, fragile, undeniable. Over the next 2 weeks, these moments became more frequent. Maya began to track movement more reliably. She turned her head when someone entered the room. She blinked when a light was shined near her eyes. Her breathing changed when Michael spoke, as if some part of her recognized him before her mind could admit it. The first word. In early September 2019, Maya spoke her first coherent word. It happened without drama. Whitaker sat beside her, reading aloud from a book about Arizona's forests, ponderosa stands, high ridges, the way sunlight filters through branches. She was halfway through a paragraph when Maya's lips moved. At first the sound was so quiet, Whitaker thought she imagined it. She stopped reading and leaned closer. Maya's mouth opened again, and the word came out, barely more than a whisper, but distinct enough to freeze the room into stillness. Whitaker wrote it down immediately, noting the time and the context, the way clinicians do when they know they've just witnessed something rare. She asked Maya if she was cold now, if she needed another blanket. Maya didn't respond. Her eyes drifted back to the ceiling, and the silence returned. But the word had been spoken. And once the door cracks open, it never seals quite the same way again. Fragments, then phrases. In the days that followed, Maya began to speak in pieces. Single words, short phrases, repeated as if she were testing whether they belonged to her. Dark trees, water, alone. Each one landed with the same flat tone, like inventory rather than conversation. Whitaker recorded everything, listening for patterns. Most words were sensory: cold, hunger, fear, and the environment itself. There were no names. No Mom, no Dad, no Samantha. It was as if Maya's world had been reduced to the raw vocabulary of survival. Detective Larson was updated and requested permission to speak with her. Whitaker hesitated. Maya was still fragile. Pushing too hard could send her back into shutdown. Larson argued that time mattered. If a crime had occurred, if someone had taken Maya and held her, the window to find them might already be closing. Whitaker agreed to a brief, supervised conversation with strict limits. Simple questions, no aggressive probing, and the session would end at the first sign of distress. The detective's visit. On a quiet afternoon in mid-September, Larson sat beside Maya's bed. For the first time, she was upright, propped on pillows, her body still too thin for the hospital gown, her eyes turned toward the window, where sunlight slipped through blinds. Larson introduced himself slowly and told her he was there to help. He said he wanted to understand what happened in the forest. He asked if she remembered going on a hike 3 years earlier. No response. He asked if she remembered getting lost. Nothing. Then he asked the question he'd been trying not to ask too soon. "Did anyone take you? Did anyone keep you there?" Maya's expression changed, tight, sudden. Her jaw clenched. Her hands gripped the blanket. Her breathing picked up in short, sharp pulls. Whitaker immediately stepped forward, signaling the session was over. Larson nodded, stood, and placed a card on the bedside table. He told Maya that if she ever wanted to talk when she felt ready, she could reach him any time. Maya didn't look at the card while he was there. But that night, a nurse found Maya sitting up, staring at it. She'd picked it up and was tracing the edges with her fingertips, like she was trying to understand what it meant. The nurse asked if she was okay. Maya looked up with an expression that was hard to read. Fear, confusion, something else underneath. Then, for the first time, she asked a question. "How long?" The nurse didn't understand at first, asked her to repeat it. Maya did stronger now. "How long was I gone?" The nurse hesitated. She told her, 3 years. Maya's face didn't change. She nodded as if confirming something she already knew, and then lay back down. "I want to remember." The next morning, Whitaker arrived to find Maya sitting in a chair by the window, the first time she had moved from the bed on her own. Michael was in the room, sitting across from her, crying openly. Maya was looking at him, really looking at him. Whitaker approached slowly and asked how she was feeling. Maya turned her head and spoke in a low, steady voice. "I want to remember." Whitaker sat beside her and asked what she meant. Maya's hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. She said pieces were missing, gaps she couldn't fill. She remembered the forest, the trees, the cold nights, the hunger. But she couldn't remember the moment she left the trail, or why she stayed, or what kept her from leaving. Whitaker began a careful approach, guided recall without pressure. She asked Maya to focus on sensory details first. The smell of pine, the sound of wind, the feel of dirt under her feet. Maya's memories returned in brief, disjointed flashes. She remembered walking the trail, confident, calm. She remembered stopping to take a photo of a valley view, the forest rolling out in green layers below. She remembered hearing something, a rustle that didn't fit the normal language of the woods, and then a blank. The next thing she remembered was darkness, waking on the ground with a pounding head, vision blurred. She didn't know where she was. She tried to stand and her legs failed. She called out and heard nothing come back. She remembered crawling, hands out, feeling trees and rocks, trying to find something familiar. She remembered finding a thin stream and drinking until her stomach hurt. She remembered chewing leaves and bark, even though it made her sick. She remembered freezing nights, shivering against a trunk so violently she thought her bones would break, and she remembered something else, something that didn't fit neatly into lost hiker logic. She remembered fear of being found. Whitaker asked what that meant. Maya looked down at her hands and whispered that at some point she stopped wanting to be rescued. The idea of returning to noise, people, expectations, felt unbearable. The forest, brutal as it was, became the only place that made sense. No past, no future. Only the next hour, the next mouthful, the next night survived. Whitaker asked if she ever tried to leave. Maya nodded. She said she tried many times early on, but every time she thought she was close to something, a trail, a way out, something stopped her. Sometimes exhaustion, sometimes fear, and sometimes it felt like the forest itself shifted, like paths moved when she wasn't looking, like everything turned her in circles. She knew it didn't sound logical. It felt real, she said. The second search begins. Larson read Whitaker's notes with a detective's discipline, separating what might be trauma perception from what might be traceable fact. He didn't dismiss the distortions, but he also couldn't build a case on feelings alone. He returned to the forest in early October 2019 with a larger team more thorough than the first return. This time, it wasn't just look for a campsite. It was map everything, photograph everything, treat the ground like a witness. The team included forensic specialists, a botanist familiar with regional edible plants, a geologist who understood the terrain, and 2 experienced trackers who had worked missing person cases across the Southwest. They set up a base camp a short distance from the tree where Maya had been found and began dividing the area into sections. Metal detectors swept through dirt and pine needles. Soil samples were collected. Tree bark was examined. Every stone and branch near the fire ring was documented before anything was disturbed. What they found over the next several days formed a picture that was clearer and more troubling than anyone expected. The stones around the fire pit weren't native to that exact spot. The geologist confirmed they'd been carried from at least half a mile away. Someone had gathered them. Someone had arranged them. The ash in the fire pit contained not only wood traces, but also organic remnants, bones, seeds, and what looked like degraded cloth fibers. This wasn't one desperate fire. It was a routine. Nearby, the team found additional markings on surrounding trees. Not tally marks, different shapes, deeper, more deliberate. Some were crude symbols, circles with radiating lines, stacked triangles, angular patterns that didn't correspond to any trail marker system. One tracker, Evan Mercer, suggested they might be territorial indicators. Signs meant for someone else, a warning or a boundary. Then the botanist, Dr. Claire Stanton, found something that made the hair on the back of Larson's neck rise. In a small clearing about 30 feet from the main area, several wild edible plants had been tended, soil loosened, competing weeds cleared, growth patterns managed like a rough garden. It wasn't agriculture in the usual sense, but it was intentional cultivation. Stanton said it required consistency and knowledge. It wasn't something that happened by accident. And it wasn't the first strategy a panicked, disoriented lost hiker would think to develop. Larson asked the obvious question. Could Maya have done it? Stanton hesitated. Possible, she said. But not likely early on. The level of care implied a long-term pattern. Either someone who already knew what they were doing, or someone who had lived out there long enough to learn through seasons of trial and error. Then they found the shelter. It was barely a shelter, a lean-to made from fallen branches, bark, and brush, tucked into a natural depression between 2 boulders. Partially collapsed now, but still readable. 1 person wide, moss and pine needles layered inside like a crude bed. Forensic analysis found hair inside that matched Maya's DNA, confirmation that she'd been there. But there was more. Mixed in with Maya's hair were several strands that did not match. Not enough for immediate identification, but enough to change the case. Larson felt his stomach tighten as the preliminary report landed in his hands. If Maya hadn't been alone, then this wasn't a survival story. It was something else entirely. Larson ordered the team to expand the search radius immediately. If another person had been in that pocket of forest, close enough to share a shelter, close enough to leave hair behind, then there would almost certainly be more signs of long-term human presence. People who live hidden don't leave a single trace. They leave a system. The trackers moved first, spreading out in widening arcs, reading the ground as if it were a map written in pressure, weight, and habit. Before the day was over, they found what they had been hoping not to find. A second camp, about a quarter-mile east, beneath a heavier canopy where the light faded early, and the air felt colder, they discovered a second campsite. This one wasn't just a place someone had stopped. It looked established. The fire pit was larger. Flat stones had been placed to form a crude cooking surface. Nearby were the remains of a primitive smoking rack, a rotted wooden frame, and long decayed fragments that might once have been animal hide. Bones were everywhere, stacked in tidy piles. Most were small game rabbits, squirrels, birds, but there were larger bones too, suggesting deer or boar. Many had been split for marrow, the kind of practice that indicates someone who understands survival and refuses to waste calories. Then a forensic technician lifted a flat rock near the fire pit and found a cache buried beneath it. Inside were items that did not belong to Maya. There were pieces of clothing, faded, torn, and clearly from different garments than what she'd worn on the day she vanished. There was a hunting knife with a bone handle, its blade worn but still kept sharp. There was a coil of thin rope, frayed at both ends. And there was a small notebook, swollen with moisture, its pages stuck together, the cover warped and softened by time. Larson stared at it longer than he meant to. A notebook meant thought, intention, a voice. What the notebook contained. The notebook was sealed and transported to specialists who could separate the pages without destroying what remained. Under controlled conditions, technicians photographed each sheet, lifting layers slowly, treating the paper like fragile skin. There were no conventional dates, no calendar days, no June 15 or Tuesday. Instead, entries were marked by seasons, weather, and natural rhythms. The return of winter, the first hard cold, weeks of dry wind, the shift into monsoon heat. The handwriting changed from page to page. Sometimes it was neat and almost careful. Other times, it was jagged and cramped, as if written in agitation or urgency. And the content was worse than the condition. The writer referred to Maya as the girl, or simply she, as if she were a thing that had appeared in their world, something to manage, monitor, and keep. One entry described winter returning again, and the writer's frustration that she wouldn't eat. Another described finding her near a ridge, calling out for help, and bringing her back, the way someone might retrieve an animal that had wandered too far. A pattern emerged quickly and repeated relentlessly. The world outside the forest was chaos. The forest was order. The writer believed they were protecting her, saving her, while admitting, without shame, that they prevented her from leaving. There were passages that sounded almost tender in the most disturbing way. Sitting near her while she slept, watching her quietly, talking to her, even when she didn't respond. And there were lines that made Larson feel physically sick. Calm, controlled statements that treated captivity as care and control as love. The notebook did not read like a confession. It read like doctrine. The psychological assessment Larson gave the notebook to a forensic psychologist, Dr. Simon Kessler, who specialized in fixation and predatory delusion. Kessler analyzed the language, the shifts in tone, the repeated beliefs, and the way the writer framed themselves not as a criminal, but as a guardian. His conclusion was blunt. The writer showed traits consistent with a severe delusional disorder, combined with obsessive tendencies and a distorted moral framework. They believed the outside world was corrupt or dangerous. They believed isolation was purity and truth. They believed they were a caretaker, even as they described preventing escape and controlling Maya's movement. Kessler flagged what he considered the most chilling implication. The voice in the notebook sounded practiced, not newly formed. The writer's relationship to the forest felt established, almost intimate, suggesting they had been living in isolation long before Maya ever entered their orbit. If that was true, then Maya hadn't stumbled into a random opportunist. She had wandered into someone's world. DNA and a wall. The unknown hair recovered from the shelter, and additional trace samples were processed and run through every database Larson could legally access: criminal records, missing person files, military archives, national collections. No matches, nothing that could be tied to a name, an arrest, a missing report, or a recorded identity. Larson contacted Park Services and local agencies with a simple question that had no clean answer. Had anyone ever reported sightings of someone living off-grid deep in the Tonto? Stories surfaced, as they always do. A hunter claimed he once saw a man near a cave on the southern edge of the forest, but when he returned with others, the cave was empty. A retired ranger remembered old rumors from the early 2000s. Someone who avoided trails, left strange markings on trees, and never approached people. A few hikers reported finding odd symbols carved into bark years earlier and assumed it was vandalism. None of it could be confirmed. None of it gave Larson a suspect he could put a face to. He now had a notebook, DNA, multiple campsites, but still no name. And the worst possibility settled behind his ribs like a stone. If someone could live hidden in that landscape for years, they could remain hidden indefinitely, especially now that they knew attention had turned toward their territory. Back at the hospital, Maya recognizes the writer. While the forest investigation hit a wall, Maya's recovery continued. She was able to walk short distances with assistance, and her speech improved in intermittent bursts, more words, occasional short sentences, followed by stretches of silence when her nervous system seemed to retreat. Whitaker focused on safety before memory. She helped Maya's body learn, again and again, that the room was real, that doors were not traps, that no one was going to emerge from the shadows. One afternoon, with careful preparation, Whitaker showed Maya a photograph of the notebook, just the cover, and a blurred portion of writing. She asked whether it looked familiar, whether Maya remembered anyone writing while she was in the forest. Maya stared for a long time. Then she nodded once. She said she remembered someone writing by the fire at night. She said she never saw the person's face clearly. They stayed at the edge of the light where features don't resolve. But she remembered the sound, the scratch of a pen moving across paper. Steady, repetitive, as familiar as wind through trees. Whitaker asked if the person ever spoke to her. Maya closed her eyes. Her hands tightened around the chair arms. Yes, she said, but not like normal people. The words, she explained, felt strange, as if they came from far away. The person talked about the forest as if it were the only honest place left, and described the outside world as broken and false. They spoke in certainty, not conversation. Maya said she argued in the beginning. She told them she wanted to go home, that people were looking for her. The person did not argue back. They would shake their head, then walk away, leaving her alone in the dark. Over time, Maya said, she stopped trying to explain. The world shrank to a handful of trees, a patch of dirt, a fire ring, and a routine built around hunger and waiting. She existed day by day the way trapped things exist, measuring life in small units, because anything larger would break the mind. Larson, receiving these updates, felt both closer to the truth and farther from justice, because now he had confirmation of a second presence, and still, he had no way to attach a real identity to the shadow the notebook described. If you want, I can also re-export Part 4 with tighter, true crime narrator. Pacing, shorter sentences, more punch, or keep this more literary investigative tone. As Maya grew stronger, Dr. Whitaker began to move the work from orientation to integration, still slow, still careful, but no longer avoiding the missing years entirely. Maya had started asking for the truth, even when she feared what the truth might contain. She told Whitaker something that unsettled everyone who loved her, because it didn't fit the clean categories people reach for when they try to make sense of captivity. "He didn't hit me," Maya said one afternoon, voice steady but distant. "Not like that." Whitaker didn't rush to fill the silence. Maya stared down at her hands, the thick scars and calluses that proved her body remembered what her mind still struggled to hold. The harm was quieter, she continued. It was control. It was waiting. It was knowing I couldn't leave even when he wasn't there. It was dependence. She described the way the person would appear without warning. So quietly, she wouldn't realize they were nearby until a voice came from the trees or a shape shifted at the edge of her vision. Sometimes they brought food, a rabbit, roots, a piece of bark holding collected water. Sometimes they brought nothing and just watched. The watching was the worst part, she said. Even when I couldn't see him, I felt him. Whitaker asked the question with clinical care. Was there physical violence? Maya hesitated, fingers twisting together. There were moments I thought there would be, she admitted. Moments when it felt dangerous, like the air changed. But he never struck me. She paused, then added, almost as if the words hurt to release. He didn't need to. He already had everything. The clearest memory. There is no way out. There was one episode Maya could describe more clearly than the others, an event she believed happened in her second year, though time inside the forest had become strange and unreliable. She said she found what looked like a trail narrow, faint, but real. For the first time in months, hope surged so hard it felt like pain. She followed it as fast as her weakened body allowed, convinced that if she could just keep moving, she would reach something. A road, a sign, a voice. But after what felt like hours, the trail looped back on itself. She was standing in the exact place where she had started. Maya said she collapsed and sobbed until her throat burned. That was when the person appeared. He stood over her in silence for a long moment, then spoke in the calm tone she had come to fear most, the tone that treated her panic as childish misunderstanding. She couldn't remember the exact words. Trauma had blurred them, but she remembered the message with absolute clarity. There was no way out. The forest was a circle, and she was at its center. He told her to stop running, stop hoping, stop waiting for rescue. He told her the outside world wasn't for her anymore. Maya said that was the moment something inside her broke, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, final way. After that, she stopped believing she would ever leave. Whitaker wrote everything down, aware that Maya's words weren't just part of therapy now. They were evidence, fragile and incomplete, but evidence all the same. Larson's shift in strategy. Detective Larson was furious at the dead end the investigation had reached. The journal, the second camp, the unknown DNA. None of it had produced a suspect. The person who wrote those pages was still a shadow. So Larson changed angles. He began contacting experts who had worked cases involving long-term captivity, delusional fixation, and what some profilers call caretaker abductions. Situations where the offender convinces themselves they're saving the victim. One of the specialists he brought in was Dr. Adrian Mercer, a criminal psychologist known for consulting on high-profile abduction cases. Mercer reviewed the case file, read selected excerpts from the notebook, and listened to supervised summaries of Maya's sessions. His assessment made Larson's skin crawl, not because it was sensational, but because it was coherent. The offender, Mercer said, fit the profile of a delusional caretaker, someone who believes the world is corrupt or dangerous and frames isolation as protection. In that mindset, captivity becomes care, control becomes structure, and the victim's suffering is reinterpreted as necessary discomfort on the way to safety. The journal's language suggested long-term solitude before Maya's disappearance. Mercer believed the person had likely been living in the forest for years, possibly decades, before Maya entered their reality. And the most unsettling part? In their own distorted way, they probably kept her alive, providing just enough food and water to prevent death, while maintaining the conditions that made escape unlikely. Not mercy, not kindness, a sustained system of control. When Larson asked whether the offender was still in the forest, Mercer didn't hesitate. Most likely, he said. People who survive that long off-grid rarely return to society. The forest is their identity now. The thought hit Larson like ice. If Mercer was right, the person might still be out there, moving through the same areas, following the same routines, possibly searching for Maya without realizing she had been found. Cameras, patrols, and nothing. Larson requested increased patrols from the Tonto Ranger Service in the area near the campsites. He arranged for trail cameras to be installed at key points, natural choke routes, water collection areas, ridges that offered quiet travel. Weeks passed. The cameras captured deer, elk, coyotes, and the occasional hiker. Shadows that turned out to be branches in wind. A blur that resolved into a bobcat at dawn. No clear human presence. Larson began to wonder whether the offender had sensed the change. More helicopters, more boots, more attention, and simply moved deeper. Or worse, slipped out entirely into another remote stretch of Arizona, where they could remain invisible. Discharge. Late November 2019. By late November 2019, nearly 6 months after Maya was found, doctors declared her stable enough to leave the hospital. She moved back to her parents' home in Flagstaff, where they had prepared a quiet room filled with soft light and simple comfort. No harsh noise, no clutter, no sudden surprises. Whitaker arranged to continue sessions twice a week at the house. The transition was harder than anyone expected. Maya found walls confining. The presence of people, even people she loved, could feel overwhelming. She woke at night disoriented and afraid, sometimes sitting by the window, staring at the dark line of trees beyond the yard, expression unreadable. Michael didn't force conversation. He sat with her. He learned, slowly, that being present mattered more than saying the correct thing. Whitaker focused on grounding techniques, ways for Maya to anchor herself when a sound, a smell, or a shadow pulled her back into the forest. They worked on rebuilding agency in small steps: what to eat, what to wear, where to sit, when to rest. Simple choices, but each one a reclaimed piece of control. Larson's visit, and Maya's conflict. Larson visited once during this period, with Whitaker's permission and under careful limits. He didn't press for details. He didn't push the notebook across the table. He simply told Maya he was still looking. He told her the case remained open. Maya looked at him with exhausted eyes and said something that stayed with him long after he drove back to Phoenix. "Part of me doesn't want you to find him." Larson asked why. Maya swallowed, as if choosing each word from a place that still hurt. "If he's caught," she said, "then it becomes real. Cameras, questions, people wanting every detail, a trial, and I'll have to live it again in front of strangers." Right now, she said, the memories still felt like a nightmare. Distant, unreal, fragmented. If the offender was dragged into the light, the story would become solid and permanent, in a way she didn't know she could withstand. Larson understood. He told her he would respect what she needed. But he also told her the offender had to be stopped, not only for her, but for anyone else who might wander into that forest and be seen not as a person, but as a possession. Maya didn't answer, but Larson saw the conflict in her face, the war between wanting peace and knowing that someone out there might do it again. Winter settled over Flagstaff with its usual quiet, weight-thin light, cold air, and the smell of pine that carried farther than it should. For Maya, that smell was a trigger and a memory at the same time. Some days it made her feel anchored. Other days, it made her feel hunted. In the first weeks after discharge, she rarely left the house. The noise of ordinary life appliances humming, a car door slamming, voices drifting from a neighboring yard could send her body into a protective stillness before her mind even understood why. Dr. Whitaker reminded the family that this was not weakness, it was adaptation. Maya's nervous system had learned that unpredictability meant danger, and it wasn't going to unlearn that lesson quickly just because the walls were different now. The first walks. By mid-December, Maya began taking short walks with her father. At first, they stayed close to the house, just the driveway, the sidewalk, a slow loop around the block. Michael didn't talk much during those walks. He let silence be a kind of safety. Maya focused on the simplest physical truths, the crunch of gravel, the feel of cold air in her lungs, the pressure of boots on her feet. Those sensations were real. They belonged to the present. And the present, Whitaker told her, was where she needed to build her home again. Some nights, Maya still woke in panic. Her mother would find her sitting upright, staring into the dark, as if waiting for something to step out of it. On those nights, there were no speeches, just presence tea cooling on the nightstand, a blanket, a hand on her shoulder if she could tolerate it. Rebuilding Agency Whitaker worked with Maya on reclaiming control in ways that looked small from the outside, but felt enormous from within. Pick your clothes, choose your breakfast, decide where you want to sit. Say stop when you need a break. Maya struggled at first. Choice had been dangerous in the forest. Choice had consequences. Choice had been punished, not necessarily with violence, but with withdrawal, fear, and the quiet reminder that escape was impossible. Back home, choice was supposed to be harmless again. Her brain didn't believe it yet, but slowly, she began to make decisions without apologizing for them. The call to Samantha. In early January 2020, Maya told Whitaker she wanted to speak with Samantha. She said it carefully, as if speaking it might break the idea. Samantha had never stopped looking for her. Even after official searches ended, she had kept Maya's photo on her phone, kept checking forums, kept scanning local reports, with the stubborn hope that most people can't maintain for 3 years straight. Their first conversation was awkward and raw. Maya's voice went quiet more than once. Samantha cried openly. There were long pauses where neither woman knew what to say, because there was no normal script for this kind of reunion. Samantha told Maya she was sorry. Over and over sorry. She hadn't driven out that night. Sorry she hadn't called sooner. Sorry she hadn't somehow known where to look. Maya didn't blame her, but she also couldn't offer the comforting words Samantha wanted. Instead, she said something simple, because it was the only thing that felt true. "I didn't know you were looking," Maya said, "but thank you for doing it." After the call, Maya sat for a long time without speaking. Her hands shook slightly. Whitaker reminded her that reconnecting was not just emotional, it was neurological. It was her brain relearning that people could be safe again, learning what she can tolerate. Over the next weeks, Maya reached out to a few old friends in small, controlled steps. Some conversations went well. Others felt unbearable. A few people tried too hard to be cheerful, flooding the silence with nervous optimism. Others treated her like glass, speaking carefully as if any wrong sentence might shatter her. Maya appreciated the effort, but she could feel the distance between herself and the life she'd once had. She wasn't the same person. Pretending otherwise only made the gap feel sharper. Whitaker helped her name the truth without turning it into a prison. "You changed," she told Maya. "That doesn't mean you're ruined. It means you survived." Larson keeps looking. Detective Larson remained in contact with the family, though his updates were infrequent and often disappointing. The trail cameras were still in place. Patrols continued. Evidence from the second camp was being processed. Hair samples that didn't match Maya's DNA were tested again and again, pushed through systems that offered only silence back. No identity. No confirmed suspect. Larson warned them of what everyone in Arizona already knew in their bones. The Tonto is enormous. If someone knows how to move through it, how to avoid trails and people, they can stay hidden for years. Maya listened to these updates with an expression Whitaker had come to recognize. A calm that wasn't calm at all, but a kind of practiced containment. One afternoon, Maya admitted something that made Michael's hands tighten on the edge of his chair. "Sometimes," she said, "I think he's still there. Not because I know, because it feels like he is." Larson didn't contradict her. He didn't validate the fear either. He simply said he was still trying. A faint hint of a sighting. In late March 2020, Larson got a call from a ranger unit near the area where one of the cameras had been installed. Nothing dramatic. No clear photo, no face. But a series of small indicators that made experienced rangers exchange looks. A fire pit that hadn't been there the previous patrol. Bones arranged in a way that looked intentional. Tree bark markings fresh enough to expose lighter wood beneath. When Larson asked whether they had seen anyone, the answer was no. But the forest had spoken in its own language. Someone might have been there recently. Larson increased patrol frequency again. He relocated 2 cameras to new choke points and requested additional units during dawn and dusk, the times off-grid people tend to move. Still, there was no definitive image. No proof. Only the growing sense that the person who wrote the notebook had not disappeared from the earth, only from the view of anyone trying to name them. Maya's private truth. That spring, Maya started walking a little farther with her father, choosing routes that stayed near town, where the open space felt different, less enclosed, less predatory. One afternoon, she stopped near a line of trees and stared at them with a distant expression. "I used to love the forest," she said quietly. "It was peaceful." Michael didn't answer right away. He waited, letting her own words set the pace. "Now," Maya continued, "it feels like a scar, like it's inside me." She swallowed, then added something that surprised even her. "But I don't want to be afraid forever." Michael told her he would be there every step of the way, not as a guide, not as a handler, just as her father, present, steady, unmovable. And Maya nodded, as if accepting an offer she wasn't sure she deserved. By spring 2020, Maya's body had largely returned to a recognizable version of itself. Her weight stabilized. Her hair grew in thicker, darker, less brittle. The wounds on her hands and feet closed into pale scars that no longer looked fresh, but would never fully vanish. The deeper damaged sleep, startle responses, the sense of being watched, persisted in quieter ways. Dr. Whitaker shifted their work from crisis stabilization to long-term management. They practiced grounding techniques until they became muscle memory, controlled breathing, naming objects in the room, sensory checks, reframing panic as a body signal rather than a prophecy. Some days the tools worked cleanly. Other days the past hit like weather, arriving without permission and leaving her exhausted. Maya began taking small steps back toward identity. She refreshed her design skills through a part-time online program, working in short blocks, stopping when concentration slipped. Structure helped. A project with a beginning and end helped. Creating something that existed outside her trauma helped. Larson's investigation, meanwhile, stayed open but thin. The DNA produced no name. The journal produced no signature beyond its own warped theology. Cameras continued to catch wildlife and hikers. Patrols continued to find hints, old fire pits, bones, strange marks, but nothing with a timestamp strong enough to become evidence. Then Maya did something that surprised everyone, including herself. In early summer 2020, She told her parents in Whitaker she wanted to return, not to the secluded pocket where she had been found, but to the Highline Trail, where it had begun. She didn't describe it as closure. She described it as reclamation. The forest doesn't get to own the whole idea of the forest, she said quietly. Not all of it. Whitaker was cautious. Revisiting the origin point of trauma can destabilize even the strongest recovery. But she also recognized the symbolic weight of what Maya was asking, to stand at the threshold and choose what it meant now. They set strict conditions. Maya would not go alone. She would not push beyond her limit to prove anything. If panic rose, they would stop. If she wanted to turn back, they would turn back immediately. No arguments, no persuasion. The group would be small. Michael, Whitaker, and a ranger familiar with the area, Ranger Lena Ortiz. On a clear morning in late July 2020, Maya stood at the Highline Trailhead again for the first time in 4 years. The parking lot looked unchanged, the same information boards, the same benches, the same view of forest stretching into distance. That sameness hit her harder than she expected. Her heart pounded, her hands trembled. She took a breath and stepped forward anyway. For the first mile, she felt unreal, as if she were watching herself from a distance. But as the trail climbed and the trees closed in, something shifted. The fear she'd rehearsed didn't arrive the way she expected. Instead came a different sensation: familiarity. Not the suffocating familiarity of captivity, but the older memory of why she had loved these places before. The air smelled of pine and earth. Sunlight cut through branches in slow-moving bars. The forest was still beautiful. A couple of miles in, Maya asked to stop. She sat on a flat rock and looked out over a valley, the same kind of view she remembered photographing on the day she disappeared. Michael sat beside her, quiet, letting the moment belong to her. After a long silence, Maya spoke. "I spent so long being afraid of this place," she said. "I forgot it was also just a place." She didn't say the forest was innocent. She didn't romanticize it. She simply separated the landscape from the person who had used it as a cage. "The one who took me tried to turn it into a prison," she said. "But it's not his. It's not mine. It's just the forest." When they finally stood to head back, Maya turned once to look at the path leading deeper. Her breath caught, but she didn't freeze. She didn't run. She just looked, then turned away on her own terms. It wasn't a cure, but it was a line drawn in the dirt. I can be here, and I can leave. In the months that followed, Maya rebuilt her life in quiet, practical ways. She continued her online coursework and began taking small freelance design jobs. Simple projects at first, then work with tighter deadlines as her focus improved. Progress came in waves. Some weeks she felt almost normal. Other weeks she went silent again, pulled inward by a smell, a shadow, a certain kind of wind. She also began volunteering with a nonprofit that supported survivors of abduction and long-term captivity. At first, her role was limited emails, administrative tasks, brief messages of encouragement. Over time, she participated in carefully moderated meetings where survivors spoke in fragments and were heard without being forced into a clean narrative. It mattered to her to be useful, not as a symbol, not as a headline, as a person. Larson kept the case alive, even as it became more difficult to justify large-scale operations without new leads. Patrols remained higher than usual near the relevant zones. Cameras stayed in place and were rotated periodically. The journal was analyzed by handwriting experts and linguists, but it offered no identifying details. No name, no clear regional dialect markers strong enough to narrow it down, no references to known events. By fall 2020, one camera captured an image at dusk that made Larson's pulse spike. A tall, lean figure moving through trees, partially obscured by shadow, carrying what looked like a pack. The picture was grainy. No face, no definitive proof. But the posture quiet, deliberate looked like someone built for moving unseen. Larson mobilized a team and searched for days. They found nothing conclusive. Old fire pits, bones, signs too common in remote wilderness to be admissible as proof of one specific person. The figure remained unidentified, and the search ended the way so many searches end quietly, with the sick feeling that the forest had simply closed behind whoever walked through it. Larson sent the image to Maya through Whitaker, asking if it triggered recognition. Maya studied it for a long time, hands trembling slightly. She said she couldn't be sure. It was only a silhouette, and memory is not a courtroom. But there was something in the stance, she admitted, in how the figure seemed to belong to the trees. "If it's him," she said softly, "I hope he stays far from anyone else." Then she surprised Larson with the part he needed to hear. "But you should keep looking," she added, "not for revenge, for safety." She said her survival had been a brutal combination of luck, stubbornness, and circumstances that could easily have ended differently. She didn't want another person to wander into the wrong patch of silence and be seen as a possession. As 2021 arrived, Maya marked the anniversary not as a celebration and not as mourning, but as acknowledgement. A small gathering at her parents' home. Whitaker, Samantha, a few trusted friends, and Larson. Maya thanked them for the patience that had kept her alive in a world where, for years, she hadn't known anyone was still calling her name. She said she used to believe the forest had stolen something essential from her. Now she believed the forest had taken much, but not everything. She was still here. She was still choosing. She was still building. Larson kept working the case until his retirement in 2023, then ensured the file transferred to a younger detective who promised to keep it active. The cameras remained. Patrols continued. The shadow in the trees remained exactly what it had always been, a possibility that couldn't be proved. Maya learned to live with that uncertainty the way she learned to live with everything else, not by pretending it wasn't there, but by refusing to let it dictate every step. In 2024, Maya released a short memoir written with Whitaker's guidance. Honest, restrained, and shaped around her own healing rather than the public's appetite. It wasn't a bestseller. It didn't become a phenomenon. But it reached the people who needed it. Survivors, families, advocates, clinicians, investigators. She read the letters that came afterward. She answered the ones she could. She let connection become a kind of purpose. And one afternoon that fall, Maya returned to the Highline Trail once more. Briefly, quietly, with strict check-ins. She walked slowly, listening to wind in branches without forcing herself to interpret it. When she reached the familiar clearing, she sat on the same rock and looked out across the valley. The forest was still vast and indifferent, exactly as it had always been. But Maya was different. She had walked into those trees once looking for peace. She had been swallowed by them. She had returned scarred, not broken. And she had rebuilt her life piece by piece with a kind of courage most people never have to practice. As the sun lowered, she stood and turned back toward the trailhead. She didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't need to. The forest was behind her now, and what lay ahead, uncertain, imperfect, real, belonged to her.